Welcome to the attendees who just joined us. We're just going to take a minute or two to make sure everybody has a chance to log on before we start the conversation. Appreciate your patience. You have joined the conversation running a restaurant during COVID-19. It's a transatlantic conversation and we'll begin momentarily. Thank you. Okay, why don't we begin? Jessica?
Hello, everybody. My name is Jessica Banuels, and I am the cultural attaché at the American Embassy in Paris. At this time, which has been extremely challenging for the restaurant industry, we at the U.S. Embassy felt that it was important to bring together people in the restaurant industry on both sides of the Atlantic. Both the United States and France have had a very difficult time with the COVID pandemic, and we're all trying to find the best ways to get through it. It's been especially difficult and challenging for the restaurant industry, and it's more clear than ever today when in France, we just learned last night that all of the restaurants in France will essentially have to close their in-dining room operations for at least 4 weeks. So we think this is a good time to have this conversation and to see if there are good ideas and best practices that we can duplicate on both sides of the Atlantic to hopefully improve the situation for everybody involved. So thank you for joining us, and thank you to our panelists, and I'll turn it back to Mitchell.
Thank you, Jessica. And I'll introduce myself. My name is Mitchell Davis. I'm the Chief Strategy Officer of the James Beard Foundation, an organization based in New York City that's kind of a national organization that supports American gastronomy, the restaurant industry, and in addition to giving out awards and various other types of programs, we have been working on a campaign called Open for Good to help the restaurant industry survive these very difficult past few months. It's a real pleasure to be with you today and to be with the U.S. Embassy in France. This program grows out of a longer relationship we have that began back in 2012 with the U.S. State Department, where we created the Diplomatic Culinary Partnership. And we've been doing culinary diplomacy programs around the world ever since then. And this was, of course, supposed to be, this relationship was supposed to bring American chefs to Paris and around the country of France. And we began, I think, in February with Tiffany Derry, who did arrive and go as planned. And then, of course, the COVID pandemic began to unfold, and we've taken the program virtually, as we have with all of our programs. But as Jessica said, the spirit of this is to really share a perspective, learning, emotion, frankly, and experience across the Atlantic. And that's kind of the true nature of diplomacy. The intended outcome is actually for all of us to learn how we can better support each other and how we can get through this time, but also more normally in other times, how as a community we can come together. The restaurant community is a global community, and increasingly so as we share on social media and through travel when times are normal. The restaurant community shares experiences, and so we're just grateful to have our panelists with us today. I'll give you a few housekeeping things, those of you who are listening. We are recording this, so if you can't make the whole conversation or you want to share with others, you'll be able to find it on the James Beard website, and we'll provide, it won't be edited, it'll be the exact conversation. We also, I will encourage people listening to think of and ask questions. There's a chat function on this GoToWebinar platform. If you put your question into chat, we'll be curating those and we'll try to get to them before the end of the hour. And if we don't answer them before. I'll also say that if you do have any technical difficulties, you can use the webinar toolbar and message the technical support, and they'll try to make sure that you can hear and see everything that's happening. And with that, I think we'll just get into this conversation. I'm going to begin. I will name and identify our panelists, but I am actually going to ask them to tell us a little bit about their unique perspective on the industry, whether as operators or as representatives of organizations like the Beard Foundation that sort of have a larger purview. And we will go, I guess, in order that you see on your screen. And I'll start with Camilla Marcus, who was the founder of Bourne here in New York City. Also, she's been instrumental in the creation of the very influential organizations during this time of the relief or opportunities for all restaurants. ROAR is how we refer to it, and the Independent Restaurant Coalition. We're also pleased to welcome Nicolas Chatenier, who is the director of the Grande Table du Monde, based in Paris, but a global organization of restaurants of the highest caliber, representing around the world. We're joined by Ann Kim, who's a James Beard Award-winning chef from Minneapolis, Minnesota. Her restaurants are Pizzeria Lola, Hello Pizza, Young Joni, which is my personal favorite, although the pizza's pretty good. I'm really excited to have you here. And Célia Tunc, who's the manager of the Collège Culinaire de France, which is an organization also representing the sort of vastness of French gastronomy. So thank you all for joining us. And as I call on you with this first question, which is to really, in as few words as you can, to describe from your perspective, changing by the day, we realize, the state of restaurants at this moment, and tell us a little bit about what you do in your day job, if you will. And I'll start with you, Célia, because you're on the beginning of my screen. Can we hear you? I think you're muted, or yeah, sorry.
I forgot to unlock the microphone. Sorry. No, thank you again. I think sharing is always very interesting and very helpful for everyone. So crossing the point of view and the situation in the US and in France is, I think, a very good idea and a good opportunity. Even if it's very difficult for French restaurant, all kind of restaurant, gastronomic, fine dining, smaller restaurant. I think we maybe have one huge chance compared to the US is all the help the government, even if it's not always sufficient, is providing to the restaurants. So we're kind of very lucky compared to the US. I have a lot of friends in Washington, DC in the restaurant business, and I know it's a lot more complicated. So even it's very difficult for us, I think we're the luckiest ones. It's very difficult because the problem is not only the charges that the restaurant have, it's the difficulty for them to cover the rent. I think you have the same issue, and to cover the rent and to see that the insurance are not helping them, and they find themselves very lonely. And yesterday, again, this new decision of the government is like treating the restaurant like as an unessential business. So it's very difficult for the restaurant to hear that they are unessential, and during the few months where everyone was mostly everyone was open, because not everyone has been able to open, but for the restaurant able to open this last few months, the good thing is we've seen the customer very happy to go to the restaurant. They were there. There was some restaurants were very, very crowded, and we've seen that the people were willing to consume more than usually. I think each customer has spent 8% more than usually in their restaurants. It's a statistic mostly the people are coming with. So I think it's a positive message for the future.
Thank you. Interesting. We'll get back to some of that. Camilla, tell us, you're calling in from the West Coast of the United States, but tell your perspective on what's happening and where we are at this moment in restaurants in the US.
Yeah, I mean, 7 months into the pandemic, we have not received a single restructuring plan or financial aid package for our industry at any level of government across the states, as far as I know. And, we are hit the hardest. 1 in 4 people unemployed right now is from our industry. We received 8% of the PPP funding back in March, which is a very small percentage given how drastically we've been affected and impacted by the pandemic. And I mean, I don't know that I have words for it. It's pretty atrocious, and it's disappointing to see. I think here in the States, and I remember feeling this in March, the day we all closed in mid-March. This being an election year is probably the worst thing to ever happen to our industry and frankly this country during such a crisis, because it really got politicized and is politicized. We clearly can see that we can nominate and vet and put in place a Supreme Court justice faster than we can help an entire industry that's very clearly crippled. And 11 million people across the country are watching themselves be totally ignored, and refuse to be helped. And when you think about scale and size, I mean, I know we always talk about airlines. We employ more people in New York in restaurants than airlines do nationwide. 10% of restaurants are concentrated in New York. And New York State and New York City has not come up with any structural plan at all, despite numerous calls for that. So, you're seeing it really, it's crippling, and it's pretty atrocious to see a government that just doesn't seem to think that that should be a priority. And we're going to see the effects of it, I think, unfortunately, for a very long time. 7 months is far too long without proper aid and assistance.
Right. Thank you for that sobering perspective. And I'll just remind our friends at home, our friends in France, that PPP was a. You want to explain a tiny bit about what that is that you use?
Yes, so PPP was, I keep saying too, I always call myself a liberal capitalist, and this is one of those situations where our systems are just very ill fit, again, for something like this, that particularly the duration. I mean, all prior crises really in the States have been, the effects are longer, but the actual crisis is actually finite. And it's really, I think, the first time that I can recall in a very long time in our history where this is still ongoing, right? Restaurants are still going through it, and our country is still going through this pandemic. It looks like another likely year, 6 months to another year. So it's just unlike anything. So the government tried to put together a plan going through banks to provide potentially forgivable loans. I mean, it was essentially a capital infusion program, sort of through private transactions and meant to go to small businesses. But when you actually look at the distribution, because it was left in private banks' hands, which is a very American thing to do, people were prioritized who had prior banking relationships. I mean, even myself, I've banked with Chase my entire life, both personally and professionally, but I don't have debt. It was the first time I ever applied for a loan application, and I was told that they're prioritizing their debt clients, which is, it's technically their prerogative if the government doesn't, sort that out. And so again, you really saw, unfortunately, a very low access when it came to, minority-owned businesses, female-owned businesses. And again, you look at hospitality, such a small sliver of a very large financial aid package, despite the fact that we're disproportionately harmed. And again, the extent, one of the few industries I love to remind our government, it's actually illegal to work from home as a restaurant. There's almost no industries where it's actually illegal to work from home, and to not have industry specific aid and to be so unprioritized in that package, again, showed sort of the negative byproduct of it.
Okay, and we'll also recall that we're talking about a country without a social safety net or healthcare or something, so that these people that you're referring to and the industry has a double burden compared to some of our friends in France. Nicolas,
well, and it's tied to employment, which people should, that was the biggest issue right at the start. Was for most people, employment is connected to health. The safety net is through your employer, which again, given who we employ, the types of people we employ, and the volume of people that we employ, that was one of the biggest struggles in a health crisis. Yes.
Nicolas, back to France. Unmute.
Eva. Yeah, Eva. Is that right? Yes. So again, yes, thank you very much for your invitation. It's very, very always super interesting to share those views between the US and France. So responding to Camilla, obviously our situation is much more positive, even though we're getting back to lockdown today. I feel that obviously we have several reasons to be quite positive here in France, especially in the fine dining industry, which I follow more closely through Les Grandes Tables. It's threefold maybe. The first fold is that there is an appetite for fine dining, and as Célia said, it's amazing how people reacted to, I mean, the reopening of the restaurants after in May or June was simply overwhelming. The demand was great. We heard of so many double-digit growth with our association members. People like Mauro Colagreco in Mirazur in Menton did his best July months ever in a 10-year activity. So lots of good news around the country, with people asking for fine dining and spending the money that they would have spent on holidays in the fine dining restaurants. And also the second thing is obviously there's so many helps from the state that I can't list them. I've tried to list, there's like 10 different schemes to help the restaurant industry. The main help is furlough, but in a very extended version of what you have. It's basically that people employed by the restaurants who are not working are paid by state. So there's no charges for the restaurateur when they're closed. And that's another question that we have, is that we have so much benefits that there's like just like almost a desire to be closed, because being closed is way more cheaper than to be open or half open. So because obviously all the workforce is taken into account by the state, and obviously food costs are disappearing. And in many cases in Paris, we've heard about rents being postponed by the landlords. So the situation is not that difficult. And obviously the banking system as well has postponed the loans. So there's been so much help for the closure. The more difficult issues is when we are back open, because obviously we're lacking the tourists from overseas in the fine dining industry, and that's shaping the business. And that has a huge impact on the business, especially in the main French capital like Paris or Lyon or Bordeaux. But so the outlook is much more positive than what we just heard from Camilla in the US.
Interesting. Thank you for that. And let's go back across the ocean. Let's go back where perhaps things are. How many of your restaurants are open? Tell us a little bit about sort of your perspective as an operator in Minneapolis right now.
Yes, so we have 3 restaurants, and for better or for worse, I'm in the middle of opening up our 4th restaurant, which was not in the plan, but here we are. All 3 restaurants are operating as takeout only models. A blessing is that all 3 current restaurants, pizza is our wheelhouse. And because of that, it is easily taken out. A lot of my colleagues do not have that luxury. They can't translate what they offered on their menus as takeout. And I've been so impressed by their creativity and their resilience and their persistence to be able to adapt and to try and really survive and change their business models. So that's how we're dealing with the pandemic currently, mostly because I didn't want to open up the restaurants unless we absolutely had to, meaning the dining rooms, when we were allowed to do that at 50% capacity. And I think I've used a lot of different analogies of the past 7 months, from being on a roller coaster to all the uncertainty. And I feel like right now I'm riding a tidal wave that ebbs and flows, that comes to shore, and I feel like, we're here, it's getting better, and then another tidal wave brings us back. And just this constant uncertainty, this constant up and down of emotions, and thinking that, you know, we've just come to a crossroads where we can get through this, something else comes to bring us back and push us back away from the shore. And I think Camilla articulated quite clearly of what is going on nationally for restaurants. It's very sombering. It's devastating. I am one of the lucky restaurateurs that can stay afloat and is maintaining that. But as we go into the winter months, where I open the paper to record surges in the virus, and dining rooms closing in Chicago and around us, and it makes me scared of what's to come. And restaurants have traditionally been very much, as a chef, your head down, task at hand, and very siloed. And one thing that I've learned from this pandemic is that we aren't alone, that this has touched us universally, globally. And yeah, Camilla's right. We have received very little assistance in the form of government help. Leadership has been non-existent. And it's really difficult when people are asking, what do we do? How do we survive this? When you don't have answers for them. And the traditional leadership that you would look to cannot provide it, or nor do they want to, or feel that it's important. And so we've had to, my colleagues, other chefs and restaurateurs have had to gather small groups to try and figure this out, to become our own leaders and come up with a solution. Because if we don't, the situation is very dire. And I don't like to think about a world without restaurants and hospitality. And we need that more than ever right now.
For sure. One of the things, the undercurrents in the conversation, if I think about France versus the United States, is of course in many ways obvious that the culture of restaurants is so embedded in France. I mean, the concept comes after centuries of sort of gastronomic evolution there, and it seems embedded both in the nature of the politics that support them, but also in the culture of the people, the diners, for whom it's so integral to their lives. And I, at the same time, to me, one of the opportunities I've seen in the US, although it's hard to realize its potential, is there has been, due to the work of Camilla and Anne and these other groups of restaurateurs, a kind of reckoning of the cultural value of restaurants in a way that isn't just places rich people go to be rich, spend their money, but actually that support communities and add liveliness to the sort of the city life on the street, et cetera. And I'm wondering if on either side of that, you could comment from your experience on that situation and the support that you found in your communities, among your clientele, but then also more broadly, culturally. I know, Camilla, in fact, in particular, you've been so many times in the news talking about the uniqueness of the sector, not just from its economic standpoint, but actually from its cultural value. You care to comment?
Yes.
I mean, Célia, you go.
You want to?
Camilla, then Célia.
Sure. So, you know, I think I always said, I actually felt over the last decade that the American restaurant community has become more like the European model. It is a full-time career. It has professionalized in a way that I think Unfortunately, I think our government and our legislators have not caught up to, and I think this was that tipping point of them realizing that. I think our industry has felt it and known it and seen it. I think the guests have appreciated that. I do think we've become more the European model of a real, full, robust sector. I mean, we're the second largest employer in the country. For jobs that really, you know, there's very few industries left with true zero barrier to entry jobs that have long-term career prospects across the world, right? You know, there's always going to be a restaurant job available no matter where you go. But what we've seen is, you know, I was nodding probably absurdly when Anne was talking, but you know, I do think our country got to see what a world was like without restaurants in March and April, and it's bleak, you know, and I think even more so than just the economic contribution and the employment, you know, that we bring vibrancy and safety to streets. You know, who's open late like that? Who's open early in the morning? It's always restaurants. It's not the bank on the corner. It's not the CVS, you know, down the block. It's a restaurant. They're the ones that remember you. They're where you spend your highest highs and your lowest lows. And, you know, they are so much part of your daily life. And even more than that, you know, we keep reminding our government, who doesn't seem to pay attention, but who was feeding first responders? I mean, first responders alongside healthcare professionals was restaurants. Restaurants were the first, especially, you know, I know in New York when we had 1,000 people dying a day, restaurants and their teams were still taking the subway, putting themselves at risk to provide food for free for hospital workers who were trying to save lives. So, you know, ironically, we're the second largest private employer next to healthcare, and we work very side by side. You know, we were the first to jump in and take care of our communities. A lot of people opened for free pantries to feed their teams for free, to offer food for those in need. I mean, we always jump in to help our communities without even thinking about it. So I do think it was probably the first time that at such a grand scale, you know, our communities and our nation sort of writ large was able to see that.
Célia?
Yes, I don't know if you are for the question about gathering the restaurants and the ideas. The Collège Culinaire de France that I manage is an association founded by Alain Ducasse, Joël Robuchon 10 years ago, and we're trying to gather restaurants, but also producers, craftsmen and women, and wine growers, all together, because we think that together we are stronger than by ourselves. And we were talking about the difficulty of the restaurants, but we have forgot to mention previously, and I think you have the same issue, that a restaurant is not a single person. It's of course the team, but it's all the people working with you and your providers, your producers, but also the taxi who used to bring your customers. And in the Collège Culinaire de France, we're always talking about a quality, you know, all the steps are very important, and we're trying to put all the people of the link of the quality together. So it's important for a restaurant to keep in touch and to gather with this producer, because they're very related. And for example, today, because we learned yesterday that the restaurants were closing tonight, we have a lot of, like Frédéric Duca, who was supposed to be with us, received today like a full vegetables from his producer south of France. So now he is with the kilos and kilos of fresh vegetables, who is trying to sell to his customer, because the link with your customers is very important. And Nicolas just before mentioned that we are missing in Paris and in France, but mostly in Paris, the tourists. But I think the restaurants, what the restaurant learn is that the link with your producer, but also with your customer, local customer, is very, very important, and you have to work on it. And for example, Anne was talking, also mentioning that now she's only working with takeout, but in France we didn't have the culture of takeout and delivery. Even with small models, like takeout and delivery are really for in France before the crisis, delivery and takeout were really for junk food, you know, and not quality food. And it's been changing a lot. And now we've seen fine dining restaurants doing delivery, doing takeout, sharing also their product with the customer to create a link and not just close the door like a lot of other business.
Really important point, I think. And I think one of the aha moments, if you will, was the realization that the restaurant is this nexus of all of these different chains, human, ingredient, produce, craft, what have you, that once it stopped, it was not so easy here, certainly, and I imagine in France, to redirect somewhere else and required some innovative thinking. Other thoughts on the sort of cultural embrace of gastronomy and restoration, Nicolas or Anne, to add?
And of course, we are. I mean, yeah, obviously, this is a culture, and we've heard from many people in the media that fine dining was kind of slowing. It was too long, could be boring, certainly much too expensive, and yet we still feel that this specific business model is very much alive and very in demand. And as Célia was saying, we've been so surprised by the resilience and the capacity of change in the industry, from 3 stars to bistro. Everyone has taken the takeaway movement and is changing so many habits. And in a way, this is very interesting. And last, maybe when you talk to many of the great chefs of France, they've used this period to lead a quieter life, not spending so many hours behind the stove. And it's been very interesting for all of them. They've discovered time for reflection, time for thinking their cuisine, thinking the way that they manage staff and so many business issues. And we've been surprised to hear that they've benefited so much from not working for a couple of months or 3 months. And this is a surprised outcome, and this is cultural as well. This is a way of an evolution to the way they're addressing their work life, and this is very interesting.
Well, I gotta say, sitting here listening to Nicolas, I think I want to move to France.
Yeah, of course. You should.
I second that.
It's quite obvious to me that there is disparity between our two cultures,
Of course.
in the way that food culturally was respected than it was here in the United States. And part of me feels like, our industry has somewhat to take some of that blame, that we've allowed this to happen, that we say it's okay to have an industry where there is disparity in pay, in working conditions, in the way we respect or disrespect it as a profession. And I think, as Camilla was saying, it's been changing, and it was going towards a progressive movement for change and equity and sustainability, but not fast enough. And this pandemic has shown us how extremely vulnerable we are. And when Nicolas talks about chefs taking this time to be able to reassess and take time to step away from the kitchen and reflect and have that support, I've never worked harder in my entire life. I know people that aren't in this industry just say, I'm so bored, I don't know what to do. I've taken up knitting and baking with sourdough. And I'm like, I don't know that I have a minute in my day to go to the bathroom, let alone fit in a sandwich for lunch. Like, constantly having to reinvent yourself and shift and change your business model because you don't know that the laws are constantly changing and there's no information. And it's been exhausting. And it is very clear to me that we do need to change some things. And it is my hope that once we weather this storm, that if there is a silver lining in this, is that we can't go back to what the status quo was here in this country. That there were many good things, but there were many things that were missing. I miss hospitality. For me, I didn't get into this industry because food is fuel. I got into this industry because I love what food does, and that's bringing people together. And now I feel like it has brought us apart. And it's sad to me. I think hospitality has changed, but I do think we can change it towards a way that is sustainable and back to the heart of what it was meant to be.
Thank you for that. That's a perfect segue, I think, to a slightly different topic, because it isn't just that we have a global pandemic that's infectious and that, restaurants might be a site of more concern perhaps than other places, but in addition, we are facing a sort of social justice reckoning in the US, a racial justice reckoning, whether it's out of the economic consequences of the pandemic or, all sorts of things that are bubbling up, as you say, that have been exposed, the lack of resiliency and the unsustainability, not of an environmental kind, but of just of a human life kind, of a business on thin margins, of an industry on thin margins. And I'm wondering to what extent you feel or hope to take Anne's idea of perhaps a silver lining in this, some of the other panelists, that there is an opportunity to rethink this. The reality of the margins of the restaurant aren't really going to change, and the money that people have to spend on food isn't necessarily going to change, and how that's going to be distributed is hard to change, but there definitely seems to be a reckoning of sorts, and I'm wondering what your thoughts are about that. The irony being, of course, generally the more expensive a restaurant is, usually the less money they make, and the cheaper ones have the higher margins, and this is hard for many to comprehend. But I'm just curious about other shifts of the type that Anne mentioned that you might imagine or hope for or see taking place. Blank stares. Camilla, I'm going to go to you.
Look, I think the reckoning is the right word. I keep saying that's sort of my theme of 2020, but I think everything's up for grabs. And I think Anne very eloquently stated, as opposed to the French system, as it seems, we're incredibly vulnerable. And I don't think we've had our fair due of recognition as a real place in, policy. And I think that's led to a lot of that dynamic of, the cheaper, right now, chains, the McDonald's of the world are doing just fine amidst the pandemic, and the places that are real community anchors that fed the front lines. McDonald's didn't feed frontline workers for free during the shutdown. Independent restaurants did around the corner who probably couldn't afford it, but did it anyway. And the whole structure needs to be rethought, from, tax incentives to liability to labor to practices to healthcare to childcare. We just, again, the second largest employer, we are not nearly as properly structured, as properly connected to our government and our policies at all levels, city, state, and federal, nearly the way that we should. And I agree with Anne. I see a pathway to a different system and a different dynamic, but none of that can change when, our industry profit margin dropped from 20% 10 years ago to 5% due to overregulation and overtaxation. You've even seen in the pandemic, as Anne mentioned, every regulation that's come down since March changes every other week, and with no help, right? We don't have the safety net, we don't have the safety for our teams, we don't have universal healthcare in quite the same way. And so something's got to give. And I do think it's very clear we're at the breaking point. And I think, this is a reckoning for our country to decide what it values. Is this an industry that's important? I think everyone in it would agree it is. I think if you had half a brain and looked at the numbers, you should come to that same conclusion. And I think, yes, understand that there's something really valuable, especially in independent restaurants. But it's going to take bold action, and it's going to take really kind of a whole rehaul and reimagining, because at a 5% consistent margin, there's not much wiggle room to change without, again, you can change, but you might be bankrupt. So it has to change really top to bottom, I think, and inside out.
Any thoughts? Our French friends? Unmute.
Vas-y, Nicolas, vas-y.
Nicolas, you're on mute.
Yes. Yeah, I wanted to talk about how fragile the business model is. And as you said, it is a very difficult job or industry. What we certainly see in France is that basically the matter is a matter of real estate, and that restaurants are a real estate driven business model. And basically in France we have this rule called fonds de commerce, which is could be translated as a premiums on real estate, and that's a very difficult concept to grasp outside of France, because it was only created to set up private pensions for independent business owners in the 1950s. So fonds de commerce is basically what you buy to get and the thing of the fonds de commerce is on a 7-year loan, bank loan. So it's basically, there's two different sets of restaurateurs or restaurants in France. You have the young ones between 0 years to 7 years that are still paying back the fonds de commerce, and this is very difficult for them until they've paid the whole fonds de commerce back. And then after the 7th years, everything open up, because you don't need to pay back the fonds de commerce. You only have to pay back the loans that you may have of your investments in terms of design and kitchen appliances and so on. And so there's a different setup, and that's me raising the question that how we should finance a new opening of restaurants in France. Certainly not through bank loans anymore, and these 7-year rules, which doesn't account for nothing in terms of business proposition. Why should you be better in the first year than after? So that's the main issue that we face with, and that's also explaining how the whole French system is working, because of this rule. So again, this is also a question of financing and real estate, I think.
And regulation, from public health to sustainability to everything that comes down and lands on restaurants. I want to remind people listening, and we have one question which we'll get to, but you can ask us questions in the chat of the talk, and we'll save some time for those at the end. I'd like to shift our attention a little bit to the consumers who might watch this, the diners who have in many communities rallied, even outside of France, to support restaurants, to ask at the Beard Foundation what they should be doing. Should we be ordering takeout, ordering wine from restaurants, ordering from restaurant suppliers, all that sort of stuff? And I'm wondering, from each of your perspectives, what's the best way for restaurant supporters, diners, lovers of gastronomy and all that you do to support, whether it's money or otherwise, and besides voting here in the US, which is an important thing they have to do. Célia, how about we start with you? Oh, sorry.
Yeah, I don't know. Just to respond to your previous question, Nicolas was mentioning two kinds of restaurants, but what we used to say in France is that there is effectively two kinds of restaurants: the restaurant, the one who cooks, and the one who doesn't cook, and just warm products. And you were talking about like the McDonald's, etc., etc. So there is a lot of them. And unfortunately, even in France, we have 80% of the restaurants in France who are only, warming processed food and serving processed food to the restaurant. So I think we need to include the customer in the reflection of the model, the economic model of a restaurant, and making them understand that when they choose a restaurant or where they choose to buy a product or wine, that should be in who they want to support. So do you want to support the increase of McDonald's and its merger, or do you want to support the diversity of the gastronomic model and the restaurant and the people they're making live? Camilla was explaining that in New York, the restaurant are the main employer, of the city. So I think we need to involve the customer in this reflection, by explaining them. And I think it's something that all the restaurants together can do. And actually, it's why in the College Culinaire we're putting together all this the restaurants who are really willing to do some real food with real producer against the one who are doing processed food. And obviously we cannot, we're not going to close all the McDonald's, etc., etc. There is room for everyone, but there is room also for real restaurant willing to cook, and this is the restaurant that we need to gather and to promote.
So spend your money in restaurants with intention to support those that are actually contributing in some way besides just feeding.
You build the future. You build the future of the city where you want, where you want to live. So if you want to live in a city with only McDonald's, it's your choice. If you want to live in a city with restaurants, and I think a restaurant is a huge contributor to social life in a city. So if you want this kind of city and live in this kind of city, you have to support them.
Yeah, and it's very much a relationship. And Mitchell, when you said what can guests do, what can consumers do, this isn't about, consumers versus restaurants, business owners, capitalism, government. It really is, and it's unfortunate that we live in such polarized times in this country. If we do not collaborate, if we do not stop, ask questions, listen, work together, we are never going to get anywhere. I think it is very important how the consumer consumes, their perspective, their level of understanding. I realized how little even our most valued guests understood about the economics of restaurants, that most restaurants are barely surviving, hanging on a string, that restaurateurs aren't getting rich from doing this, that it's mostly, unless you're a giant corporation, that it's a labor of love, and you do it for reasons outside of money. But what we've also realized is that you can't run without money, and the restaurants that really do care and do contribute to our communities are the ones that are actually spending a great deal to get that plate of food to your table. There are many hands that touch that plate of food, and I'm not just talking about within the restaurants. I'm talking about the vendors and the farmers and the winemakers and the cheesemakers and everyone that has been touched by this, which is very much a trickle-down effect. It's not just affecting us as a restaurant. So if consumers have to demand a better system, and they also have to understand what a better system implies, and that means oftentimes that you won't be able to get a hamburger for $2, to understand what it takes to get sustainable and ethical meat on your plate, what it means to pay a living wage, what it means to create an environment where you can provide health insurance and a 401k and paid time off to your staff, that it just doesn't happen. The money's just not falling off trees. That you can't expect that your plate of food, your hamburger, is going to remain $2. And while inflation continues to go up, that consumers have to be willing to pay more for that hamburger or that salad. When consumers are willing to pay hundreds of dollars for a nice pair of shoes or a designer bag, but they're not willing to pay a few dollars more for food that has been thought of intentionally and worked on with such care, they're not willing to pay $1 or $2 more. It just boggles my mind. So it is not just a shift within our industry and the practices that we need to do to make it sustainable, but also it's a cultural shift within our own country and in education, and we have to work together to get there. Otherwise, we're going to continue fighting, and we're going to go in circles, and we're not going to get anywhere.
Well, very well said. Thank you. one of the questions, well, we have a question from a listener, which I'm going to try to couch in a, many people, as we've already discussed, have pivoted from fine dining to takeout, or how to do takeout and fine dining, but some people have just abandoned, the famous Noma burger bar, which was part of the past recent experience. But then there are other things. I mean, 10 years ago, we would have been doing a panel on food trucks, and there's someone listening who's about to start a food truck, which actually is not a bad idea in a pandemic where people are supposed to eat outside and take out. And so I'm just wondering if you've seen innovative things that you may or may not have anticipated or done yourself, but that you think in sort of looking forward might be added to this kind of idea of a resilient model that brings in mixed revenue and makes restaurants have the potential to be more flexible for whatever might come. Is there anything that that you've seen that's been interesting or struck the creativity in your mind?
I mean, I'll say I think that this is I think the comment around us being so tied to real estate, and obviously as tenants, unless you own your building. And by the way, you'll see in restaurants across at least the States, if you own your building or you're a partner in your building, you have a very different survival chance here. And I think what I've seen come out of this in innovative and positive ways, I think restaurants are seeing that they are bigger brands. I mean, Anne mentioned sneakers. I think for the first time, our industry is also looking at themselves a little bit more seriously. So you're seeing people look at products. They want to start to own their customer. So not relying so much on third parties for data and guest retention and, customer communication. And I think you will see a greater rise of a restaurant as more of a 360 brand. We're so much part of someone's home. Chefs have been influencers for, again, at least the last decade. And I think it's time that restaurants take more control and frankly monetize it. So I think, you're seeing a lot more collaborations. You're seeing apparel and products and different systems getting into someone's home that's sort of taking you out of the four walls and thinking differently about brick and mortar.
Mm-hmm. There too, I would say, in the 60s, French chefs were on the cutting edge of the chef as brand in some ways, trying to expand. So that's a really interesting point. Other things you might have seen, innovations?
Yeah, what we saw in Paris is quite limited, but it's very interesting. Is the transformation of restaurants into shops, because basically the restaurants were supposed to close, but not the food outlets. And we saw many chefs using their networks of producers, starting grocery shops within their restaurants. And linked to this is the desire to stop the broking, the intermediaries, the margins that are set up to pay for distribution. There's so many intermediaries in the food chain in France. Maybe it's the same in the US. And here we saw chefs connecting to producers directly, getting their products and not charging that much in terms of margin to help just obviously use the produce from the field.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and even if I can complete what Nicolas just said, they've been doing that for their customer, but for their producer too, because during the first lockdown, it was in early spring. So, for example, the vegetables were growing very, very fast. It was a very intense period for the producer, and the restaurant needed to stay open, but also to help their producer, to survive and to be able to sell their product and avoid, to put everything to trash. And they've been proposing the product like a raw, but also they've been cooking the product not only like dishes, but also like jars. So we've been a lot of restaurants making jars of product for them, for their customer, but mostly for their producer. Again, it's the chain of the quality that I were talking, and involving everyone. So we've seen a lot of that.
Indeed. Here too, we've seen a lot of innovation and realizing how different businesses are, whether it's takeout or shops or bakeries, and people learning a little bit, flexing muscles to generate new styles of business. But ultimately, perhaps, I mean, my hope is that 5 years from now, which I know is an eternity, and who knows what will happen, but certainly in America, I believe there's been a sensitivity to the value and the craft in this space that I hope is closer to realizing some of the things we talked about our French colleagues benefiting from in terms of the fabric of gastronomy, if you will. We're about near the end, and I wonder if anyone has any concluding statements. There's a question here about what will happen in the U.S. as winter arrives, and obviously it's arriving in France too. Although you know that you will be shut down for 4 weeks, and here there's some uncertainty. I'm just wondering, as we conclude, if you have any last words of optimism or pessimism, frankly, this is an honest conversation for the next few months. Anything come to mind? Winter is coming. It's Game of Thrones out there.
Well, I'm in Minnesota, and sometimes it does feel like I'm in somewhere out in Game of Thrones land, in the Game of Ice, or in the land of ice and snow. And yeah, we received record snow last week here in October, and a lot of places throughout the country do have the luxury to have weather where they can continue outdoor dining, but it's been a topic of conversation amongst our colleagues of what do we do come the winter months when we can't have our patios open? Will consumers want to dine inside? Can we do it safely? Can we protect our team members? So it is a very big question, and I don't think anybody has the answers to that right now, but I do, you know, when you asked about what people are doing, people are very creative here, and the consumers and the guests, those that really understand what we're going through, have been very supportive and been willing to don down jackets and stand outside, you know, by a fire pit and drink cold beer and eat a sandwich, mainly because not only to show support, but I think that they want it and they need it. But yes, I do feel like I have to remain hopeful. I know a lot of people have lost hope. Restaurants have closed around us, and it's a sad place to be. But I have to believe that you know, that we can take this opportunity to embrace the moment. That it is an opportunity to have conversations like this, to talk about solutions in which to make things better, to say that the status quo was not acceptable and that we're not going to go back to that, to be open, to be vulnerable, to be compassionate, and to be active in a way, because I don't think, at least not in the short-term future, the government or those in higher powers that can make significant change for the industry aren't going to do it for us. So we as a community, as an industry, need to do it together. And it really is about what I believe the core of this hospitality industry is curiosity and creativity. And if we maintain that, I think we can come up with answers to make this better for ourselves when we come out of it.
I think it's a beautiful place to end. And thank you all on behalf of the U.S. Embassy in France and also the James Beard Foundation. I really, really appreciate you taking the time and your contributing your honest opinions about what's happening and what's in store. I also want to acknowledge, frankly, you know, we're talking about business here, and it's incredibly important, but so many hundreds of thousands, millions lives have been affected by COVID, have been lost to COVID, and livelihoods as well. So I want to take a moment to acknowledge that and to thank you all for persevering. I too believe we will all eat in hospitality, gastronomy, restoration, food, chowing down. All of that is part of what makes us human, and makes certainly me happy to be here. So I appreciate all of the efforts that you put into ensuring that that sector will be here for years to come. Thank you for listening, and we will be in touch. Good luck in the next few weeks and months.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.